Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's AML webinar with Bev McArthur, a member for the Victorian Legislative Council for Western Victoria. My name's Jeremy Mann. As the chairman of the Victorian Young Monarchists and a media spokesperson for the League, I will be hosting tonight's webinar. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to acknowledge Senator for Tasmania, the Honourable Erica Betts, and former Senator and member of the Queensland Legislative Assembly, the Honourable Santo Santoro MP. I'd also like to pass on apologies from the Honourable Elise Archer MP, Attorney General of Tasmania and AML Life member, as well as the Honourable Karen Andrews MP, Federal Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Born in Terang, Bev McArthur has lived on her family's beef farm near Camperdown for the past 35 years with her husband Stuart. As a former Corangamite Shire councillor, Bev was elected to the Legislative Council in November 2018, representing the Liberal Party for the Western Victoria region. She delivered her maiden speech on the 19th of December 2018. As a staunch supporter of our monarchy, Bev will be speaking to us tonight about the failures of the Victorian Government and why you wouldn't want a republic in Australia.
Good to go, Jeremy?
Ready when you are.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Jeremy, very much. And thank you, Philip, National Chair of the Australian Monarchist League, for the invitation. It's a great honour to be with you all tonight. And I thank you all for joining. And of course, I acknowledge Senator Betts and former Queensland member Santo Santoro. But everybody's important in this day and age, so thank you all. This is a very august body, formed in 1993, and wonderful to see that it's kept going by voluntary contributions and a great sense of voluntary participation and organisations. So well done. In this day and age, everybody seems to want funding from somewhere, but the Australian Monarchist League stands on its own 2 feet. So congratulations, I'm proud to be a member. Now, the Socialist Republic of Victoria is quite something to behold, as everybody is now learning. The failure of this government to manage a virus has just demonstrated why you wouldn't want a republic anywhere in Australia. Unfortunately, we don't have grounds for a dismissal yet. And, you know, the interesting thing is we have fixed 4-year terms in Victoria. Now, I was actually a staunch supporter of fixed parliamentary terms. I thought it would make for far more efficient government. But when you've got a socialist dictator like Daniel Andrews in charge, everybody's calling out for him to go, but we can't really do anything about it for another 2 years. So he's going to take 2 years, if he gets over this, to kind of right the ship. That's if he stays. And of course, there's a lot of chatter about whether he'll even stay on as the leader. These very extraordinary times have proven how important the monarchy is for stability. Recently, it was VP Day. The monarchy is an important link to that very proud history. Socialists would have us tear down our statues and rip up our history. The cancel culture is now gathering momentum, that we want to erase history. I've made speeches about that and done media on it to say that we have to learn from history. We shouldn't erase it. But these people don't realise that their right to protest and abuse history was won by our soldiers who fought for king and country. Republicans sometimes say the Prince of Wales doesn't care if Australia became a republic. However, after listening to his heartfelt message this week, recalling his many visits to our state and his time at Timbertop in Geelong Grammar, that clearly isn't the case. And earlier in this corona crisis, we heard the Queen's uplifting message, where Her Majesty echoed the words of Dame Vera Lynn and said, "We'll meet again." I must say we're all curious to know when we will meet again, but best we can do at the moment is by Zoom. I have a son and daughter-in-law and a new first grandchild in London. I have no idea when we'll ever see them. But what an inspiring symbol of stability and continuity is the Queen. She's seen off 15 Australian Prime Ministers and 14 Victorian Premiers, and she's made 16 visits to Australia over her reign. I think she's the absolute epitome of how statesmen should be, and all statesmen around the world could take a great lesson from how she behaves and presents the monarchy. We are so fortunate to have this system of government, in my view, when you look at all the despotic presidents that operate around the world. Now, of all these premiers, this current one is clearly our biggest threat. The Andrews government gives a horrifying insight into how a socialist may wish to remodel our system of government. And as we battle the coronavirus, we must also battle Daniel Andrews' dictatorial tendencies. According to the Economist Intelligent Unit's Democracy Index, 9 out of 14 of the most democratic countries in the world, including Australia, have a constitutional monarchy. This proves how a constitutional monarchy safeguards democracy around the world. Yet in Victoria, we're fighting to keep democracy alive. Chairman Dan wants to keep Victoria in a state of emergency forever, it seems, and does everything possible to shield his government from accountability. In these times of unprecedented executive power, government ministers' decisions must be scrutinised. When Chairman Dan wants to extend the state of disaster indefinitely, it is vital that the Parliament should debate these draconian measures and not simply accept a diktat from dear leader Dan. The Victorian Parliament sitting this week was Labor's Podicum Village, a total sham. It sat for 3 hours as a skeleton of its former self. The Minister for Health again refused to answer crucial questions relating to her critical portfolio and involvement in the hotel quarantine fiasco that's seen Victorians locked up and Australia paying the price as well. Excuse me. They say Parliament isn't sitting because of the Chief of Health Officer's advice. An example of this government hiding behind unelected officials. We will curtail your rights, impede your ability to travel, impose a curfew, and justify Parliament not sitting because of the Chief Health Officer's advice. However, this government's total contempt for transparency and scrutiny has existed long before coronavirus. One of the truly terrible pieces of legislation this government has passed enshrines in law the ability of class action law firms to pocket large portions of settlements from class actions. So important was this piece of legislation to the Labor Party and their lawyer mates and donors at Maurice Blackburn that they ensured it was the final piece of legislation before we rose in June. Maurice Blackburn, as many of you would know, the country's leading class action law firm and very close friend of the Labor Party, will benefit to the tune of millions because we've given them now a set percentage of class actions. Is this a conflict of interest? Who would have thought? Before this legislation was passed, I requested under FOI to know how many times the Victorian Attorney General had met with Maurice Blackburn's head of class actions. She refused to answer that simple question, so I've referred her department to the Anti-Corruption Commission for the unacceptable delays in this FOI request. We actually did get some information back, but I think 20 of about 40 pages were redacted. Not to mention the fact that the former Labor Premier Steve Bracks is the chairman of Maurice Blackburn, and Maurice Blackburn donated $600,000 in the lead up to the last state and federal election. But of course, he also now is in charge of the Labor Party, since they had a few problems with Adam Somyurek trying to unseat the Premier. We all might think he was a hero now. Anyway, Steve Bracks is not only in charge of Maurice Blackburn, but he's in charge of the Labor Party, a definite conflict of interest. The corruption of this government is boundless. And these are the sort of characters Republicans would like representing us on the world stage. Being a national figurehead of unity. Dedicate their lives to duty and public service. The Andrews government only care about themselves and enriching their mates, which includes creating dubious and outrageously overpaid public servant positions in this time of economic catastrophe for so many Victorians. Again, it was the Attorney General whose department I found advertising the position of a Director of Inclusion and Intersectionality, a job that comes with an annual salary of $250,000, no less. You would think that the Labor government would reconsider their obsession with far-left ideas like intersectionality, totally at odds with meritocracy, after the disastrous decision to use a particular private security firm to operate hotel quarantine due to its accordance with social inclusion policies. But like all ideologues, the government seems to be sticking to its guns and will continue to entertain these out-of-touch ideas that clearly hinder governance and add extra unnecessary government expenditure to this state. The bureaucracy should not be focused on how to be the most inclusive, but instead how most efficiently to deliver services for taxpayers and actually how to stay out of individuals' lives as much as possible. But Republicans love officialdom and would love to add yet more layers of bureaucracy in Australia, which we just can't afford. As of June 2019, there are 2 million public sector employees in Australia, 242,000 in the Commonwealth, 1,610,000 split across the states, and 194,000 in local government. That is more than the population of South Australia, and Senator Abetz nearly 4 times that of Tasmania. The combined salary of these people is more than $166 billion for 8.4% of GDP. The average public sector employee wage is $95,000, which is $10,000 more than the average wage of someone in the private sector. Our public servants' salaries are higher than all but one of 26 OECD countries. In Victoria, the public service wages bill has increased by 25% since the Andrews government came to power in 2014. The bloated bureaucracy in Victoria now has 47,000 employees, which is 12,000 more than 2013. A particular type of overpaid unelected czar has done extremely well under the dictatorship of the commissioner. There are now more than 50 commissioners in Victoria. How does 12 multicultural commissioners sound? Victoria has 2 electoral commissioners. Who knows how New South Wales copes with just 1? In Victoria, a commissioner is paid up to $701,000. Over a 5-year appointment, that's $3.5 million. Under each new commissioner, there are numerous staff many being paid between $193,000 and $480,000. Recently in Parliament, I asked about passage of a bill to create a wage protector and commissioner. I asked if the government had even thought about the cost of the office and how many new staff would be employed. Their response, they hadn't really thought about it. Clearly, they were just going to put it on the tab like everything else. Not to mention the ridiculous overlap in their roles. We've got a small business commissioner whose job is to contribute to the government's program to reduce red tape affecting business by promoting greater efficiency in the administration and enforcement regulation. But meanwhile, we have the Better Regulation Commissioner, whose job it is to boost Victoria's productivity, competitiveness and economic jobs growth by cutting red tape and improving regulation. We have a local Jobs First Commissioner who advocates on behalf of Victorian SME small businesses, as well as promoting the employment of apprentices, trainees and cadets on government projects. That begs the question, what does the Victorian Skills Commissioner do? We've got a Health Complaints Commissioner and a Mental Health Complaints Commissioner, a Disability Services Commissioner and a Disability Worker Commissioner. On my count, this government has created more than 30 new commissioners. Unelected commissioners have enormous power and it is at the whim of government who gets appointed. The new Transport Accident Commissioner, for example, is a former senior advisor to the Minister for Police. Speaking of police and commissioners, Chairman Dan has appointed the former Police Commissioner, Ken Lay, as Lieutenant Governor. The Lieutenant Governor is the Deputy Governor and carries out the duties of Governor, which include reviewing and giving royal assent to legislation when the Governor is not in the state or incapacitated. The role has almost always been held by the Chief Justice and certainly never a policeman. But, you know, why have an intellectual, intelligent and independent figure when you can appoint someone with no legal or judicial experience whatsoever who will be hugely grateful to you, the Premier, for giving them the job and therefore unlikely to kick up a fuss or hold the government to account? Think about that. When the Governor is out of state, the acting Governor is a former policeman. Victoria is fast becoming a police state. I don't blame the police for this. I blame this government, the Premier and the Police Minister. And this is just another example of Chairman Dan and his government elevating the role of the police, watering down traditions and installing their cronies to important conditional roles, making a mockery of the role of governor and our system of government. Furthermore, Daniel Andrews signing up to the Belton Road Initiative is such an insult to our democratic tradition and shows you he prefers an authoritative communist regime to our own Commonwealth government. Andrews is literally supporting a foreign communist power over the Australian government. Chairman Dan's Chinese love affair clearly isn't reciprocated, however. Victorian barley farmers, some Australian beef producers have been whacked with tariffs. But now we're seeing the same thing happen to our wine. Well done, Daniel Andrews. And just like to quote what Sandra Best has quite rightly said in an Instagram post I've just seen, China's anti-dumping investigation into our wine is baseless and further economic bullying. We won't stand for it. Well, I'm so pleased the federal government won't stand for it because Daniel Andrews has visited China numerous times. Labor MPs have gone to China on 25 different trips that we know of in the last 4 years. Under his state of emergency, we now have curfews in the Melbourne metropolitan area and some other places. You know, you can't go out of your home between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. in the morning. You'll be fined if you put the rubbish bin out at 8:01 p.m. These sorts of edicts are made under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act 2008, and they allow the Chief Health Officer to direct health officials to detain people, search premises without a warrant, and force people or areas into lockdown. It grants powers to the Chief Health Officer to do whatever is necessary to contain the spread of the virus and reduce the risk to health of Victorians. It can be imposed for a maximum of 6 months, which would end on September 13, or should end on September 13. But Daniel Andrews has forecast that he would like to make an amendment to this legislation to extend this state of emergency, this power over our lives, even further. The state of disaster imposed under the Emergency Management Act can be declared if the Premier is satisfied an emergency, quote, constitutes a significant and widespread danger to life or property in Victoria. It allows police to enforce rules such as 8 p.m. to 5 p.m. curfew, restrict people's movements to within 5 kilometres of their houses, gives authority to suspend acts of Parliament and take possession of properties. It runs until September the 2nd, but can be continued if the Premier decides it's necessary on the advice from Police Minister and Emergency Management Commissioners. Both a state of disaster and a state of emergency is enacted by the Premier on the advice of the Emergency Management Commissioner. These rules are quite extraordinary, quite draconian, and quite frankly, I think the lockdown presents more of a problem than the virus itself. We're now spending millions and millions, federally and at a state level, in mental illness. I just read today where the crime rates are going up. You know, domestic violence has increased, child abuse has increased, suicides have increased, to say nothing of the hundreds of thousands of businesses that will perhaps never open their doors again, and the workers who we permanently unemployed. And government, the federal government, who is propping all this up through JobKeeper and JobSeeker and many other schemes, can't expect the federal taxpayer to continually pick up the tab for this lockdown in Victoria. There are so many anomalies in the system as well. The restrictions mean that people get very mixed messages about whether you can go to exercise or whether you can't, whether if you're in isolation, whether you can go out or you can't. So, and there are exemptions every day because nobody ever thought any of these things through. So many people have had to, beg and plead to get exemptions. So you wonder whether they're worth having in the first place. And this business of a worker or an individual having to carry around an identity paper to prove you're allowed to go and work or to prove who you are is, I think, unheard of in Australia. But there's much influence from China in Mr. Andrews' office as well. You're probably aware of his senior advisor, Marty May. You're aware of Miss, what is her name? Let me see here. Nancy Yang has completed a Chinese Communist Party propaganda training course, and along with Mr. May is a member of the Chinese Community Council of Victoria, which is described by foreign influence experts as the foremost united front organisation in Victoria. Why am I a monarchist? Well, I've just detailed to you the cost of government, especially under a socialist regime like we have in Victoria. Imagine if we had an elected president, and I can't imagine this operation getting voted in unless you had an elected president. If you just appoint one like we do currently as the governor, well, why change? So I imagine the only way it's going to get across the line is by having an elected president. Now that would be a fourth level of government. I've described how overgoverned we already are in this country, how much it costs to do government in this country, let alone the cost to business and enterprise because of our layer upon layer of regulation and bureaucracy, which makes it very difficult for any enterprise to be productive, and to go through the hoops of getting a permit to do anything is extremely hard. So I can envisage somebody wanting to be the president. Now, you know, imagine it could be Kevin Rudd, could be Clive Palmer, could be Pauline Hanson, could even be Steve Bracks. And imagine what they would promise to get elected. The cost to the Australian community would be boundless and so unproductive. So for me, the monarchy is not only a very good system, but it's cheap. I don't want another level of government in this country. I already think we have too many and we are over-governed. So for those reasons, I will support the monarchy. And, you know, I also subscribe to the view that if it ain't broke, why fix it? Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Bev. We've now just got just a couple of minutes for some questions. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank you for a very informative and insightful presentation and talk. So if you do have questions for Bev, would you mind posting to the Q&A panel, which you'll find in the Zoom, in your Zoom application on your device or browser. So I've got a couple of questions here. So the first is from Pierre-Louis, who says, what advice would you give to young people seeking to preserve our monarchy?
Well, I think they need to catch up with Jeremy and the young monarchists who are doing a great job at promoting why this is the best system of government, quite frankly. And I think it's that, you know, the system of government has been very beneficial to this country. I don't see how you could get a better system by becoming a republic. So, you know, I think young people like Jeremy are doing an outstanding job on the campuses of universities and through this organisation and through their social media activities. I think nowadays we all depend on social media. So get on board with Jeremy is be my suggestion.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question from Alan Sterling, he said, will the upper house, trying to read this. Will the upper house be opposing any moves by Daniel Andrews to extend his emergency powers to extend stage 4 beyond the middle of September?
Thank you for that question. Well, you know, the coalition in Victoria have made it very public. We unequivocally will oppose this legislation. We'll do everything to try and stop it. But the upper house in Victoria is a strange animal. There are now as many independents, if you take Adam Somyurek, who's now sitting on the crossbenches, although he hasn't turned up yet, as there are coalition members. So the government usually has no trouble getting whatever legislation they want through the upper house. Mr. Medic from the Animal Justice Party, who have us all eating fake meat and soy juice, I refuse to call it milk, always votes with the government. He's an extreme left ideologue, a former CMFEU organiser, so they can easily depend on his vote. Samantha Ratton from the Greens always votes with the government. That's enough. They only need to. So, you know, we have great difficulty getting anything through the upper house opposing the government. I did manage recently, because I'm opposing furiously the dumping of waste from the botched Westgate Tunnel project going into my electorate in Melton, into Bacchus Marsh, into a tip there right beside schools and houses and aged care institutions and fabulous horticultural production. And the entire crossbench voted to support the motion that we put up opposing the dumping of this waste, and another one which called for all the documents to be released as well. So the very rare occasions can we get the support of the upper house crossbenchers. And on all the hundreds and thousands of people that have been writing, and I'm writing back to every one of them, I have suggested that they concentrate their efforts on lobbying the crossbench, every one of them, to make sure they oppose this legislation. They are the people that will decide whether this emergency continues, and it will be on their heads. Apart from being on the heads of the dictator, it will be on the heads of the crossbench if they do not oppose extending this state of emergency.
Thank you, Bev. So we're out of time. I will try and squeeze in one more question, though, from Nicholas Tam, who writes, God willing, will we become the first generation in history to witness and celebrate a Platinum Jubilee in 2022? And will you lobby for a Platinum Jubilee holiday in Victoria in 2022, implemented by public celebrations, and maybe a commemorative gift?
Well, look, okay. You know, I'm on the record of saying Victoria has already more public holidays than anywhere else in Australia.
Right.
And they present huge costs to businesses. And we've got this ridiculous scenario now where we've got a public holiday prior to the grand final. Now, the grand final is not going to be held in Melbourne, obviously, and we can't go and have a march in the streets to support footballers and football teams because we're not allowed to gather. So why would you continue with having a public holiday for football when we can't do anything, and when businesses are on their knees? Many have closed in Melbourne anyway. So look, I would not commit to supporting another public holiday in Victoria. I think we're up to 13.
Yeah, there's a very good point. Perhaps replacing the one existing one with
yes. Well,
yeah,
replace the useless football one would be helpful.
with a much more warranted one. Bev, thank you very much,
yes,
everyone, for attending this evening. So we're going to close off now. A copy of this webinar will be available on our website, and we do hope to see you all at our next webinar. I believe that we'll be announcing that very shortly. Once again, Beverley McArthur, thank you so much for your time this evening.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Okay, great. I'll just go and I go and share my screen, and we will play the Royal Anthem. Here we go. Thank you.